Bienvenidos. My name is Jorge Fanjul, and I am from the class of 2020 at the McCourt School of Public Policy, pursuing a master's in policy management. I am also a member of Georgetown's inaugural cohort of National Urban Fellows. Thank you. This fellowship develops accomplished and courageous professionals from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds to be leaders and change agents in the public and nonprofit sectors, with a strong commitment to social justice and equity. Our motto is that you are enough. It is a great... Thank you, Chris, and thank you for saying my name right. It is my great honor on behalf of my class to introduce Senator Bernie Sanders.
Have a seat. Good to have you here.
Good to be with you, except the mic does not appear to be working.
Yeah, we got him on the mic, right? All right. So let's start here. Describe to me when and how you came to realize the acuity, the seriousness, the urgency of this problem.
I have a very good friend. His name is Bill McKibben, I think many of you know. And Bill lives about 30 or 40 miles away from me in Ripton, Vermont. And a number of years ago, Bill sat down and talked to me about the climate change crisis that we are facing, which is obviously more severe now than it was when he first talked to me about it. And I guess the point that I want to make, Chris, to everybody in the room, is that sometimes as human beings, we have a hard time imagining the future. You know, we kind of look at next year and the year after that is kind of like it was last year. But if the scientists are right, and I believe that they are, next year is not going to be like last year. And 5 years from now is not going to be like 5 years before. We are facing an unprecedented global crisis. It disturbs me very, very much that we have a president who believes that climate change is a hoax. And what disturbs me about it is that that attitude on his part, on the part of the fossil fuel industry, not only threatens the well-being of our country, it threatens the well-being of the entire world. I have been criticized, well, I'm always criticized, but I have been particularly criticized for bringing forward the most comprehensive climate change proposal that I believe any candidate anywhere has ever brought forward. And the reason I did that is, unlike Trump, I do believe in science. And what I believe is, if we do not act in an incredibly aggressive way in moving away from fossil fuels to energy efficiency and sustainable energy, and what makes this issue even harder and more complicated, it's not just an American issue, it is a global issue. We got to lead the world. But if we do not do that, the planet that you will be inheriting and your kids and your grandchildren will be inheriting will be increasingly uninhabitable and unhealthy. And we have a moral responsibility to make sure that that does not happen. And as president, this will be a major top priority for me.
You just said that it would be a major top priority, and I asked this to Senator Bennett, I'm going to ask it to you, that I think there are people that view this as an issue, and there are people who view this as the issue. And which are you?
It's not an issue on a list of 14 issues. We're talking about the future of the planet. So you have got to put it at the very, very top. But I have been asked many times by you and others, you know, is it the only thing we can do? I happen to believe that when we have a government, I intend to lead that government, which speaks for the needs of working families and not for large corporations, we can do a number of things. But obviously, there's nothing more important than saving the planet. But among other things, we do need to make sure that every American has health care as a human right. We need to make sure that you guys can go to college without coming out deeply in debt. We need to... So maybe I'm old-fashioned and overly optimistic, but I think government can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time.
Well, I want to talk a little more about the prioritization, the political obstacles, but just to dig a little deeper on, it's interesting to hear you talking to Bill McKibben, obviously, who has been a prophet on this.
Yes.
What have running for president always strikes me as a fascinating, as a reporter, I'm always a little jealous of it, even though it looks like it would be exhausting. But you get to talk to a lot of people all day long in all different kinds of places that you might not normally go. And I'm curious, what do you hear? Like, what have you learned about this as a frontline issue from the actual process of running for president?
Can I stand up? Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. A couple of months ago, I was in Paradise, California. Do all of you remember Paradise, California? And a few years ago, this is a town of 26,000 people, small town. In Paradise, California, in the midst of the terrible California drought, which is obviously attributable to climate change, 86 people died, 18,000 structures in that small town were destroyed. It's going to cost some $16 billion to rebuild that community. This is one small town. Carmen Yulin Cruz, and I should say that obviously in Paradise, that whole town was destroyed because of a fire as part of a range of fires that California has never seen before, within a drought that California had never seen before. Carmen Yulin Cruz, some of you may know, is the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and a co-chair of my campaign. And Carmen has told me time and time again, and I visited her in Puerto Rico, the absolute devastation that took place there. So I talked to her. All of you were watching TV, MSNBC covered it, the horror that we saw recently in the Bahamas. We can all remember what Hurricane Katrina did to folks in New Orleans. Go to Charleston, South Carolina, beautiful city. Time after time, they are flooded. Talk to farmers in Iowa, where the heat is getting worse and crop production will go down. Talk to foreign diplomats, and you find that in Guatemala, a poor country to begin with, many of the people have been driven into deeper poverty because of the drought and the heat that they are experiencing. Talk to people in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, and understand already what climate change is doing. This is not a problem for tomorrow. And if you talk to people, as I do, from all over this country and all over the world, you know what's going on. And if we do not get our act together in an unprecedented way, the situation will become much worse. Think about Bahama, think about Puerto Rico in your mind, and think about these type of extreme weather disturbances hitting us more and more frequently with greater intensity. Think about people all over the world driven from their homes because they can't grow crops anymore, they can't find drinking water, they're going to go elsewhere. And what the CIA and the Department of Defense tells us is this creates a major international national security issue when large numbers of people are migrating and fighting for land. So here is the point. It seems to me you can approach this problem in one of three ways. You could do what Trump does, which is basically irresponsible and pathetic, and that is I'm being kind to him. Right? Or, Chris, you can do what some of my colleagues do and say, look, of course climate change is real, but let's not overdo it. You know, we have a limited amount of money to spend here, and we got to be modest, and we got to be realistic about it. And a lot of folks are saying that. Maybe, you know, I don't know what to tell you. I happen to believe in what the scientists are telling us. And that means that if we're going to save the planet, we have to be extremely bold and extremely aggressive. Let me say this, because we don't see it much on TV. He knows my criticism of media, right?
Yes.
All right. And we certainly don't hear about it in Congress. And guess what? We're going to have to take on the greed and irresponsibility of the fossil fuel industry. All right? There's no other way around this. Now, I wish I could tell you I had a 16-point plan that would do this, but at the end of the day, you have executives in the fossil fuel industry and the oil companies, coal companies, gas companies. Their scientists know exactly what they're doing. In fact, as you know, there's strong evidence that ExxonMobil, their scientists were telling them what, for decades, that the product that they are producing is destroying the planet. So how do you deal with executives who are in companies making billions of dollars a year in profit, and the product that they are producing, happens to be destroying the planet? You got that? You got to deal with that. And we not only are going to have to tell them that they cannot destroy the planet for their short-term profits, politically, we're going to have to stand up to them. And essentially what my campaign is about, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or the healthcare industry, which made $100 billion in profits last year, or the private prison industry, which makes money by throwing Americans into jail, we have got to stand up to the greed and corruption. I know those are strong words, make some of you uncomfortable, all right? I don't know how much they teach about that here in Georgetown, all right? But we cannot do what has to be done in this country. I wish I could tell you otherwise. I really do, because I'm asking a lot of you. But we have got to stand up to the fossil fuel industry if we are going to save the planet.
So if that's the case, I mean, let's dig in on this a bit. I'm going to put aside, so the plan calls for $16 trillion in spending.
Yes.
And I'm just going to lay my cards on the table and say, I don't think the constraints are economic. I think that the scale of the problem is such that it's defensible. It's totally defensible to find that money, spend that money, and we're at such an Archimedean point, it even probably makes sense, right? Because of the loss. So the constraints to me aren't on the government spreadsheet side. The constraints are political. So you mention World War II, because the size we're talking about is World War II scale mobilization as percentage of GDP.
Yes.
And what I keep thinking about is, FDR tried to mobilize the country before Pearl Harbor, and he couldn't do it. We had Lend-Lease, we had an America First movement. He was fighting, but slowly but surely trying to get people to move towards war. People were resistant to it for understandable reasons. They didn't want to go to war. We had just come out of the Depression, right?
Yes.
Pearl Harbor changes that. We entered the war. What you're asking is to produce the conditions of World War II style mobilization in the absence of a Pearl Harbor, in the absence of a catalyzing event. And what is that? What is the roadmap to get there?
Chris, can we turn the mic up just a little bit?
Yeah, can you turn the mic up?
Guys, if you could turn it up just a little bit. I just want to make sure they hear me way back up there. All right.
It's harder for me to rate him in when he's standing.
I agree with 90% of what Chris said. But what I don't agree with you, Chris, on is whether or not we have seen Pearl Harbor. I think you've seen the Bahamas, you've seen Katrina, you've seen drought and floods all over the world, you see the migration of people. You are seeing it now. Climate change is not going to be one attack.
Sure, yeah.
It is attacks that are taking place, if you like, all over the world right now, impacting hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. So I think anybody who has eyes to see, anybody who believes in science, understands that the devastation is already taking place, maybe not as in a dramatic fashion is December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. But it is there all over the world. And let me just say this too, and I'm not sure that I'm right, and frankly, I'm not sure that I can pull this off. But obviously, the president of the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America, has got to lead the world. Again, not an American issue, it's a global issue. And here is my dream, and I'm not here to tell you that I could snap my fingers and make it happen. But given the unprecedented nature of where we are in terms of climate change, what we have got to do, and as President of the United States, this is what I would do. I would make an appeal to the rest of the world and say, you know what? We are now spending as a planet over $1.5 trillion a year on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other. And maybe the horror of what climate change could do to countries all over the world might just, under strong American leadership, bring these countries together in a way that says, you know what, instead of spending $1.5 trillion on weapons of destruction, why don't we pool our resources and fight our common enemy, which is climate change?
So in terms of, to go back to the political constraints here, because there was a run at this in 2009 when you were serving the Senate.
Yes.
Waxman Markey, Nancy Pelosi works very hard and under great duress, we should say, political exposure to her members, to pass that out of the House. Democrats have 60 votes in the Senate, although it's for a very narrow window of time because of Al Franken's delayed seating. It dies in the Senate. You were there for that.
Believe me.
Yeah, unlike many of the people that you're, in this field. So you experienced it. What are the lessons you drew from that if you're going to go to Congress as President of the United States to try to pass $16 trillion in? Here, let's both stand up. All right.
All right. The world, I'll tell you what my view is on that, Chris. And I was in endless amounts of meetings on these issues. We used to meet once a week and so forth. The world has changed. I think the terrible extreme weather disturbances that we have seen, the fact that all over this country, people now are seeing the impact of climate change, not from a philosophical or theoretical point of view, they're seeing it with their own eyes. The world is very different today than it was back in 2009. And also, what we are seeing is a generation of young people, including people in this room, who are prepared now in a way that was not the case 10 years ago, to stand up and fight to save the planet. So right now, just yesterday, I believe, University of California, I don't know if you guys know this, University of California announced, this is a huge endowment fund, huge pension fund. They announced that they intend to divest their funds from fossil fuel industry. And all over the country, we are seeing that movement. Give you another example, Chris, and you tell me if I'm wrong here. Back to the media. All right, we're having this program on climate change. I don't notice that you have a guy who's denying climate change over there. Right. How many years ago was it that on not just NBC, CBS, ABC, they were too cowardly? The media was too cowardly to say, we're going to talk about the dangers of climate change. They couldn't do that. Power of the fossil fuel industry is too great. So we're going to talk about having a scientist over here talk about climate change and what's happening, and we're going to have some guy for some corporately funded think tank tell us why it doesn't exist. That doesn't happen anymore. All right, the media has caught on in the last few years. Climate change is real. We're beginning to have some serious discussion, including what we're doing here today.
Let's talk about the plan that you have for a little bit. To me, there are a few things that stand out about it, right? So one is the scope. It's I think 5 times larger, 3 times larger than the next biggest, just in terms of the dollar price tag. But one of the parts that I think is most interesting, and I don't know if I understand this right, so I want you to take me through it, is essentially a complete public takeover of all the utilities in the country?
Nope.
Okay. So explain to me how it works.
Here's how it works. And getting back to your analogy, good analogy, I believe, in terms of Pearl Harbor and mobilization. I'm going to answer your question, but what Chris was talking about, many people don't know this. And Chris, you correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but the United States got involved in 2 wars in 1941, in Europe and in Asia. And started off really without a whole lot of resources militarily. We had to rebuild the army and our industrial capabilities. Truth is that within 2.5 years, say by the middle of 1943, the war was essentially won because the United States completely revamped its industrial base, not to be producing refrigerators and cars, but tanks and planes and guns. In 2.5 years, an unbelievable, unprecedented economic transition. What I believe is we need to move in a similar direction because the threat now is not Nazism or fascism, it is climate change. So to answer your question, what we do is build upon and expand what the Tennessee Valley Authority is doing. The TVA is a public utility which generates electricity and sells it to wherever it sells it. And we have a number of similar type agencies. So what we are proposing, in fact, is for the federal government to be a major producer of wind, solar, and other sustainable energy, and then sell that out to utilities. Some of them will be public utilities. My city has a public utility. Some of them will be private. But where the federal government will play a much more active role is in the production of sustainable energies.
Let's talk also a bit about implementation, because this is implementation, right? There's a real devil's in the detail situation where you have, say, I think a $50 billion climate resiliency fund. There's a crash program to improve storage, right? All of these are enormous pools of money. And again, I think you could argue they're in scale to the problem. But you're talking about administering this at a level that hasn't been done since World War II. It would be an enormous change to the capacity of the government.
Chris, what you are telling me is that this is tough.
Yes.
I acknowledge that. Okay? But what is the alternative? All right? I'm told that it is expensive. And I'm told by Chris, correctly so, this is administratively very difficult. He's right. But you tell me what the alternative is if we do not act boldly and aggressively. All right, not only are we fighting for your kids and your grandchildren to be living in a planet that is healthy and habitable, all right, but I should also tell you that this plan, Chris, in the middle of that transition, creates up to 20 million good-paying jobs. All right, how so? We're going to need we're talking about energy efficiency. And that means an understanding that in my state of Vermont, where a lot of old buildings all over this country, we could retrofit buildings to cut the utilization of energy by 50% or more. It takes a lot of workers to do that. If we are going to be aggressive in moving to sustainable energy, wind and solar, I want those panels and other technologies to be done here in the United States of America. Massive amounts of work that have to be done. If we're talking about the electrification of our transportation system, that means creating a new rail system in America. We are already way behind Europe and Japan in that regard. That takes an enormous amount of work, building those locomotives and those trains and the subway systems. So, look, I will not argue with you for 1 second that this is going to be administratively very difficult. But nobody has given me an idea of what a better alternative is.
Let's talk about a world in which you're elected to be President of the United States, the Democrats retain the House of Representatives, and Republicans retain the Senate. A possible world that one might inhabit.
A world that I will do my best to prevent.
Of course, yes. And Michael Bennett said the same thing. What is your understanding of what the tools are available, and how much are you willing to push the frontier of executive action under those circumstances?
Obviously, I like that phrase, push the frontier. That's, in other words...
Well, the president's done it on the wall and things like that.
Right, exactly. You know, what Chris is saying is that especially under Trump, he has used executive orders very frequently and very aggressively. And I certainly would do that in terms of climate change. I work with Alexandria Cortez-Ocasio in introducing legislation which would declare climate change a national emergency.
And you would do that unilaterally and from the executive?
Well, I think it is a national emergency, and I would use all of the executive powers that we have. But here's the other thing, you know, and I answered this question, you know, you and I have discussed this a million times. Chris and I go back a few years.
We're the same age.
And he's always trying to ask. And that is, you talk about the possibility, which is true, of Republicans retaining control in the Senate. And by the way, you got some conservative Democrats as well. Okay. Right, yeah. So it's not all Republicans. But I'll tell you what I believe, and it's not just using the executive orders, the powers that the president has. It is mobilizing the American people to put pressure on every elected representative at every level of government to do the right thing. And by the way, a lot of that responsibility is going to fall on your generation. All right, so I'll do my job. But if millions of people are mobilized to demand that the United States Congress have the courage to take on the fossil fuel industry, if you are mobilized, the American people are mobilized to tell anybody, mostly Republicans, some Democrats, that they ain't going to get reelected unless we move aggressively and boldly on climate change. If we can create that type of movement in America, that type of consciousness, we will succeed.
One of the things that you could do, I think, through executive action would be litigation. There's a mention in the plan when you talk about sort of holding fossil fuel companies accountable. We know that there are both private plaintiffs and states that are suing in a model that's not dissimilar from the tobacco lawsuits, which of course created billions of dollars of funds in public health. Would you use the Department of Justice for litigation against fossil fuel companies?
Duh. Of course I would. And I'll tell you something, the answer is yes.
Right now they're not a party to it, we should be clear.
No kidding,
right,
because in Donald Trump, you know, Trump is an ally of the fossil fuel industry. In case you haven't heard, I will not be an ally of the fossil fuel. And the other thing you can do, you know, and I don't have the whole list in front of me, but in terms of executive orders, you certainly, unless I'm very mistaken, can stop the drilling and the exploration that is now going on public lands.
You would end fossil fuel extraction on public lands?
Absolutely. That's on day one.
But let's just play out that which I think you're right. I mean, I think that's within the executive. Obviously, there would be a lawsuit. You'd fight it out in court. That's the way these things go. But that would be an immediate disruption to the people that are currently extracting fossil fuel on public lands. And I know that you, like many others, say we're going to target jobs and investment to those folks. But I guess the question is, like, play out what that looks like if I'm an oil field worker in West Texas, or I'm doing natural gas on public lands right now, and that's my job, and Bernie Sanders comes in on day one and says, no more. What happens to me?
What happens, and let me repeat what I've said many, many times. Chris is raising a very important issue. I believe, I don't know, that I may well be the most pro-worker member of the United States Congress from a lifetime perspective. You know, over a 20-year period in Congress, no longer than that, almost a 30-year period. Time flies when you're having fun. I have, I think, 100% lifetime AFL-CIO union voting record. So let me repeat what I've said many times. The guys who work on oil rigs, people who work in coal mines, people who work in the fossil fuel industry. They are not my enemy. They are my friends. And we are not going to do what others have done and turn our backs on those people. And as you know, if you're familiar with the proposal that I've introduced, we have allocated tens of billions of dollars for what we call a just transition. And so what we're saying to those workers, look, we don't hold you responsible for causing climate change, all right? But we have got to move away from fossil fuel. And what we build into our proposal is 5 years. 5 years of full pay, of health care, of job training, of education. Nobody has ever been as generous in a transitory process as we are. I'm not going to say, Chris, if you want to press the point, that there are people who'll be hurt. I got that. And it doesn't make me happy. But we are doing everything that we can to protect those workers. We're going to create, while we will lose some jobs in the transition, of course, we're going to create 20 million new jobs, and we're going to do everything humanly possible. Nobody has done more in a transition period to protect workers than this proposal does.
Can you... Have you ever had the conversation with your colleague Joe Manchin on this? Can you get Joe Manchin's vote on this?
Joe Manchin is the senator from West Virginia, which is a state with a lot of coal.
Who also ran for office with a famous ad in which he shot the climate bill from 2009, Waxman Markey.
Well, what I would say to Joe, who's a friend of mine, and anybody else in the Senate, and anybody else in the House, we are playing for the future of the planet, okay? And as I have said before, I intend as president not only to be commander-in-chief of the military, which is part of the job description, but also to be organizer-in-chief. In other words, I will be in West Virginia. I don't know how Joe, you can talk to Joe about his views on these things, but I will be in West Virginia, which is, by the way, a very poor state. And we've got a lot of support in West Virginia, a lot of great people there who are struggling. It's the center of the opioid epidemic, among other things. And we're going to go there, and we're going to help rebuild states like West Virginia, where poverty is very high, where the life expectancy is actually going down. And I don't know what Joe's views are, but I will be in West Virginia rallying the people of that state, the people of Kentucky, the people of states all over this country to make it clear to their elected officials that the time is now to save the planet and to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. Let me also say something. And we have to deal with this issue. It's the same issue we deal with in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry is corrupt. They are engaging in not only in greedy actions, but in price fixing, okay? And they sit around a room and they raise the prices, collectively, different companies, and thousands of people a year die because they can't afford the medicine that they need. I got to deal with that issue. I got to deal with the legality of people intentionally, in collusion, raising prices that are killing people. But the other issue that I have to deal with is right here. Now, you know something about that. Maybe you can help me out. What do you do? What do you do? And I want you all to think about it, because the answers are not so simple, but I have my ideas. What do you do with an industry who for years spent, tens of millions of dollars into phony think tanks, corporately run think tanks, putting stooges up on television, telling the American people, well, the evidence is not clear whether climate change is real or it's not real. They knew that it was real. Their own scientists told them that it was real. What do you do to people who lied in a very bold-faced way, lied to the American people, lied to the media? How do you hold them accountable? How do you hold fossil fuel executives who knew that they were destroying the planet but kept on doing it? We will hold them accountable.
Let me just, we're going to go to a question at UNH so quickly, but are you talking about civil? So right now there are lawsuits precisely on this, that's on the civil side, but you seem to be indicating criminal accountability.
I'm not a lawyer, and I'll need a good attorney general to help me out on this one. But this is what I think. It is one thing, you're producing a product, and you produce the product, and then you learn that the product that you're producing is killing people, right? Which is the case, say, with the Purdue and Johnson & Johnson opioid manufacturers. The evidence is pretty clear that in terms of Purdue and Johnson & Johnson, they learned at a certain point that the opioids they were producing were causing an epidemic and people were dying. And you know what they did? They continued to produce it and hire more salesmen to go out and sell it. What do you do with those folks? Now, because you have in this country, which is a subject for another discussion, a corrupt criminal justice system, CEOs and millionaires don't go to jail. People go to jail, kids go to jail for selling marijuana, but if you kill hundreds of people or thousands of people and you're a CEO and a billionaire, you don't go to jail. That's the nature of the system in America. It's a system I intend to change. But you ask me a question, and I can see the tone in your voice is you're not sure. But what do you do if executives knew that the product they were producing was destroying the planet, and they continue to do it? Do you think that that might be subject to criminal charges?
I don't know.
Oh!
I'm not running for president.
Well, I think it's something we should look at.
All right. Let's go to our first student question. We've got a bunch of viewing parties and crowds assembled at campuses across the country, and this one comes from the University of New Hampshire. Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm a freshman here at UNH Durham, and in my Homeland Security class, we learned that every dollar spent on crisis prevention in terms of natural disaster prevention is $2 saved on crisis repairs. And I was wondering what you would do as president to strengthen organizations within the government, such as FEMA, that help in crisis management to help strengthen the resilience of our country from natural disasters.
Okay. I'm not sure that I heard every word, but issues on resilience?
Resilience and also prevention. And there's some stuff in your plan about FEMA that
absolutely says. By the way, I'll see you at UNH pretty soon. New Hampshire's a very popular place now for politicians. The answer is we include in our proposal many, many billions of dollars for prevention and to do everything that we can to protect those communities who time and time again have been hit hard by extreme weather disturbances. So the answer is absolutely. What I will not do, by the way, is to have a situation where some millionaire or billionaire owns some fancy home on the coast and the house gets destroyed and they rebuild it, it gets destroyed again. Federal government should not be putting insurance money into those folks. But resiliency is enormously important. I mean, we're seeing it in Florida, in Miami, we're seeing the need for it. In Charleston, we're seeing the need for it, God knows, in Puerto Rico. So the answer is yes, and we look forward to working with you all to make that happen.
We'll go up to the upstairs balcony there.
Hello, Senator Sanders. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Maggie Gruber, and I'm a senior in the college majoring in economics. I would like to know how you plan to coordinate with other countries for environmental improvement so that our position in international trade does not suffer. How will you create environmentally conscious jobs so that our economy stays competitive in the global network?
As I indicated before, what makes the challenge of climate change so difficult is it's not just an American issue. Now, we can argue about what we have to do in America. Truth is, we can do all the right things tomorrow. And you know what? If you've got countries around the world that are continue to producing huge amounts of carbon emissions, the problem remains dire. what I hope to do and why this proposal is so expensive, and one of the many reasons, is that we put money available, we put money in this program to help countries, especially developing countries around the world, in their transition. And number two, I think the President of the United States has got to lead the world. Now think, you got a president right now who denies the reality, and actually, as you know, his policies are making it worse. He's encouraging the production of more fossil fuel, making it worse. So imagine having a president who is calling emergency meetings, not only gets the United States back into the Paris Accord, that's the easy part, but is leading the world at the UN and in all kinds of forums to demand and to help countries around the world work together to combat climate change. And as I indicated, I think not only in the United States do we have the potential to create many millions of good-paying jobs, I believe that is the case all over the world. And one of the areas where our companies, our scientists, our engineers can play a huge role is when we give them the green light and we give them the funds for research and development to come up with ideas in terms of sustainable energy, in terms of electrification of our transportation system. These ideas can be shared with countries all over the world. So I believe that at the end of the day, what I am proposing is good for our economy, good for the world's economy. And let's not forget in this discussion that we're not only talking about the fight to save the planet in an abstract sense. A young man from New Hampshire asked me, what do we do, to prevent damage? We are talking, if we don't act, about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and more than that, I'm sure, all over the world in incredible damage if we don't transform our energy system globally.
Okay. I want to do one small follow-up, a fairly detailed question, but there's $200 billion in your climate plan for global climate investments. And the logic there is about the fact that the US, along with developed countries, put most of the carbon in the air, right? From the standpoint, when you say developing countries, do you consider China and India as developing countries in this standpoint, or developed?
I think we were thinking more of poorer countries. As you know, I know less about India. China has been making, they're working at both ends actually, into coal, but they're also big time into sustainable energy as well. So I think mostly we're focusing on countries in Latin America, in Africa, and poorer countries in Asia.
I think we're going to go to USC. We've got some folks there and a student there ready to ask a question. USC, there we go. Hey, USC.
Hi, Senator Sanders. I'm Morgan Stevens. I'm a student here studying journalism and political science. So my question to you, you recently just said that you won't turn your back on workers in places like West Virginia. So as fossil fuel jobs are replaced by environmentally sustainable jobs, as president, how do you plan to make sure that these workers are trained to compete in a new, greener industry?
Because we will invest heavily in those communities that are most impacted by the transition. So that is where our investments, a lot of the investments will be going. And at the end of the day, if you look at states like Kentucky and West Virginia today, those are states that are struggling. Those are states which have a lot of poverty, have a lot of people working for $8, $9, $10 an hour. I think we can do better, and I think the investments that we are talking about will benefit the people of West Virginia, Kentucky, and other fossil fuel states. And the other point I made is that in an unprecedented way, we are protecting those workers by saying, you know what, you're going to have your salary for the next 5 years. You're going to have health care. I hope to pass Medicare for all by then anyhow. But they will have health care, and they will get the job training and the education that they need. So we are paying a lot of attention to those workers, but we also understand that in the process we're going to create some 20 million good-paying jobs. Thank you, Morgan, for your question.
Let's go down here, right here in the room.
Good afternoon, Senator Sanders. It's an honor to meet you. My name is Srishti Kemka. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service, and my question is, recently the International Organization for Migration has projected that between 25 million and 1.5 billion people will have to leave their homes by 2050 due to climate change. People from the poorest and smallest nations will likely be forced to migrate first. As the United States is leading the world in carbon emissions, what role do you believe the United States must play in regards to these inevitable climate migrants?
Great question.
It is a great question. And obviously, the United States, but not just the United States, all of the wealthier countries are going to have to play a role. I'm repeating this point, but I think it just needs repeating. We are looking at an unprecedented crisis, and you're talking about one of the manifestations of that crisis. What we are seeing in countries all over the world is the land that people are tilling to grow their crops is becoming drier and drier. People cannot find water. If you cannot grow crops and get food and have drinking water, you're going to pick up and leave. And when you leave and migrate to another country by the hundreds of thousands, you're looking at the potential of war. So we need to be mindful of that reality, and we need to do everything that we can to have the whole world come together to address that type of migration. It means, and by the way, there's so much overlap. Now you're getting into the immigration crisis, aren't you? In a certain sense, not only in the United States, but all over the world, where people are forced to leave their homelands for a variety of reasons, political, or in this case, climate change. So all I can tell you that the President of the United States, the most powerful country on earth, can play a major role in getting countries all over the world not only to transform their energy system, but to deal with the immediate impact of climate change, which is the mass migration of people. How do you make those people comfortable? Where do they go? How do you house them? How do you feed them? How do you get them jobs? How do you rebuild their communities so that maybe they can return in the near future? Big issues. But the President of the United States, unlike this president will not ignore the problem. This president, me, will work with countries around the world to address it. Thank you for your very good question.
That's a great question. Let me follow up and just concretize this a little bit. Right now, obviously, the amount of refugees we take in is at historic lows in terms of the recent history. And there's a lot of things that can be done in the executive in terms of asylum categories. Would you favor expanding the asylum categories, which are enumerated, right, to include a category for people that are specifically pushed out by climate?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely something that we have to look at, and I think I would be positively disposed to that. But it has to exist all over the world. What she raised is, it's not just people in Latin America who would gravitate to the United States.
Sure.
It is people all over the world. And, it means that we have to deal with the crises in these countries right now so that people can possibly stay there. And we have to welcome people all over the world. We're talking about God knows how many millions and millions and millions of people who are going to be dispossessed as a result of climate change. It's a huge issue.
We're going to go up to the balcony here.
Hi, Senator Sanders. Thank you for everything you've done for this country. It's an honor to even just be speaking to you right now. My name is Roya Wolf. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service studying energy and environment. And my question for you is, minority and low-income neighborhoods and communities in transition are disproportionately targeted by industries that follow the path of least resistance when deciding where to locate hazardous waste sites and other polluting facilities. More than half the people in the United States who live within 3 kilometers, 1.86 miles of a hazardous waste facility are people of color. How will you regulate these corporate actions in order to fight environmental, racial, and socioeconomic injustice?
Thank you very much for that excellent question. I was in the Bronx, New York, some years ago, and I was told by people who know the issue, and I think they're correct, that something like 25% of the children living in that low-income area have asthma. And you're seeing, the questioner is exactly right, that by definition, rich people do not live near coal-burning plants or other fossil fuel enterprises. Rich people in general, are not living near the rivers, which will flood. And if you just saw something, you pay attention, interestingly enough, in the Bahamas, where the devastation was terrible, but the poor people who are living in these cardboardy type wood, poorly built shacks, they got wiped out. Rich folks who live in sturdy mansions, they got hit too, but they survived it much better. And I think that's the point you're making. So poor people, by definition, are impacted more by climate change and by pollution in general. I was out in California a few years ago. Didn't know that until I was out there. You asked me a minute ago what I learned. I don't know if you know this. In California, there are tens of thousands of homes in the agricultural area, often Latino workers who work out on the farms. They can't drink the water out of their faucets because it's so toxic. It's not just Flint, Michigan. This goes on all over the country. And obviously, it impacts poor people more than wealthier people. So to answer your question, both in terms of pollution issues and in terms of climate change, we put an enormous amount of money to protect the most vulnerable people, who are often people of color and poor people. So, our proposal is expensive. And one of the reasons it is expensive is we address the issue that you raised.
All right. Great question. Go down here.
Hello, Senator Sanders, and thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Megan Hunt, and I'm a political science major at Trinity Washington University. And my question is that a large amount of the fight to combat climate change has focused on the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise, the reduction in aquatic life, along with the gigations of CO2 in our planet. However, there are many workers who are put in danger from the current temperatures. Representative Chu from California has sponsored House Resolution 3668, which will force OSHA to provide health awareness in regards to heat-related illnesses, hydration breaks, and shaded rest areas to workers. What measures would you take not only to reduce CO2 emissions, but to assist day-to-day outdoor and indoor workers from these heat illnesses?
That's a great question as well. And you're talking about the immediate impact of climate change on workers' health, but health in general. All right? So if you are working outside, you're a farmer in Iowa, a farmer in the Midwest, how many hours are you going to be able to work when the number of 100-degree days gets longer? If you're working in any profession out there, you are under more danger. And I'll tell you something else. When the weather gets very, very hot, it is older people and it's children who are most vulnerable. Recently in the heat wave in Europe, I think, many, many hundreds of people died as a result of that. So to answer your good question, obviously, we have to pay attention to what the immediate impact of increased heat will do to workers, but to do the whole population. And again, the reason that our bill is so expensive is we address that issue as well.
All right. Next question.
Good afternoon, Senator Sanders. Thanks for being here. My name is James Gordy. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And my question is, would you encourage public ownership of energy companies in an effort to combat climate change?
Well, right now, Chris and I discussed this a little while ago. What our proposal does do, big time, is greatly expand the role that the federal government is playing in the production of energy, big time. But the plan does not include the nationalization of the private utilities. But this is, what we will do in terms of the fossil fuel industry, not the utilities. We will, and right now, every single year, the fossil fuel industry receives hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks and subsidies. We will end that. That we will end.
I want to follow up on that because this is a thing that you say. I think it's I've seen estimates that range all the way up to $400 billion. I've seen lower ones. When you say we're going to end those, I mean, that means a tax bill that goes after specific, I mean, there's a lot of ways that they use the system, right? Because a lot of it's capital and depreciation. Like, how targeted is that? How do you think about that?
Well, for a start, you know, as you know, through Trump's tax bill in general, which benefited all of corporate America,
right.
Fossil fuel industry benefited from that very significantly.
Sure.
Right? So we will end all tax breaks and raise taxes on the fossil fuel industry as specifically as we can.
Hello, Senator Sanders. It's an honor to meet you. My name is Isabel Anaya, and I'm an exchange student here at Georgetown at the German and European Studies program. The region of the tropical savannas in Bolivia, the country where I come from, it's been burning too. And unfortunately, we have not been able to put down the fire or to control it. So what would be your policy towards Latin America during a situation such as the fires? And if you were to be president, would you give the same importance to crisis occurring in a country like Bolivia as you would do in a country like Brazil?
What's going on now in the destruction of the rainforests is extraordinarily dangerous, not just for Brazil, but for the whole planet. I guess the rainforest there has been termed the lungs of the planet. It absorbs CO2 and, you know, creates oxygen. So to answer your question, I would, as President of the United States, working with other industrialized countries, give all the support we can to those countries trying to do the right thing and hit very heavily on those countries who are doing, as is the case with the rainforest destruction right now, who are doing the wrong thing. Now you got Trump, this guy in, what's it, Bolsonaro is an ally of Trump's, same mentality. You know, so Trump has nothing to say on this. Needless to say, I would. So we would reward with carrots and sticks. The carrot is do the right thing, you will get the support of the industrialized wealthy nations. Do the wrong thing, there will be sanctions and penalties if you're trying to destroy the planet. And here is the story, what's going on, it's not just Brazil, we are doing it. When we produce an enormous amount of carbon, we are impacting the people of Latin America and the people of Africa. That's what we are doing. And when the people of Brazil, the government there allows their rainforests to be burned, they are impacting the United States, China, and India. We are one world, and we are, I think, increasingly aware of how small this planet is becoming. What one country does impacts another. We've got to work together, and the major countries led by the United States have got to support countries, third world countries and others doing the right thing, and penalize those countries like Brazil doing the wrong thing.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. So what I'm hearing from you is some kind of, when you talk about the sticks, some sort of coercive carbon diplomacy, which is to say states that are going in the wrong direction. How far are you willing to take that? I mean, that can be quite explosive. In fact, that is the tripwire right now. The reason Paris came together is because everyone is sort of self-policing.
Well, let me just suggest again, I think the world has changed a little bit. And I believe, you know, there's going to be a student strike. When is that, tomorrow or?
Tomorrow.
Okay. Good for you. And I don't know where I'll be tomorrow, but I'd like to be out on the picket line with you guys. But, you know, Chris, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the world is in a different place than it was a few years ago. And you cannot sit idly by, not just the United States, but the rest of the world, while we're in this together, you know? And if Brazil is destroying its rainforest, it impacts all of us. So not to take strong action, which means sanctions, you know, the United States, you know, we are dealing with Saudi Arabia, which is a terrible dictatorship, a murderous dictatorship. And yet we sell them all kinds of weapons, which they're using in Yemen and elsewhere, which is bad unto itself. But we, and not just us, the major countries on earth have got to come together to do everything we can to encourage countries to do the right thing as we lead the effort, and to discourage countries from doing the wrong thing. And I think we use all the tools at our disposal to do that.
All right, final question down here at the microphone.
Hi, my name is Aida. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics. My question is, socially constructed roles often put women at a disadvantage in preparing for climate change, especially in developing countries, and the US does bear much of the responsibility for climate change. Not only do we need to make sure that we're working to drastically reduce our emissions, but we already need to compensate for the damage we've already done. So what do you plan to do to make sure women in affected countries have the skills and space to lead in climate adaptation planning processes in their own communities?
Well, good. Unlike the current president, who loves authoritarian governments all over the world, who believes that women do not have the right to control their own bodies, I hold a very different point of view on that. And among many other things, my first day is going to be a very long day, I'll tell you that. I made so many promises, I'll be up all night, I'm sure. We will end this Mexican City agreement, which denies women all over the world federal US money if countries or organizations are involved in birth control issues or abortion rights and so forth. So obviously, I believe that women all over the country, all over the world, and all over our country have that right. And second of all, unlike Trump, I know this is a radical idea, I believe in human rights and democracy. All right. And when we talk about human rights, we're talking about women's rights. And in the midst of everything, what we have got to do is know the terrible exploitation that is taking place against women in many, many, many parts of the world, Saudi Arabia among many others. And I will use the powers of the presidency in any way I can to push for human rights and democracy, which to me means women's rights as well.
All right. Senator Bernie Sanders, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was good. We're going to be back in 15 minutes with John Delaney. Don't go anywhere.